To those belongs chant and popular devotions in Northern Europe from the 13th through 16th century. She is interested in the history of book production with emphasis on manuscript and early music printing. And I think it's really comes handy because just in printed books are also very valuable sources for Cantus Fractus. Otherwise, she's interested also in ethnography of early music and the use of medieval Renaissance genre in the construction of cultural nationalism in the 21st century. And she's interested also in Shona membran music of Zimbabwe. She recently completed her book project on music, liturgy, and confraternity devotions in Paris and Tournai, which is to be published by Rochester University in coming month. And we all know also her very valuable catalog of annotated office manuscripts preserved in Flanders. So thank you, Sarah, being with us and to present us a keynote on topic. Very, very interested, I think.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Let me get things set up here. See if I can share my screen. All right. Okay, well, first of all, I'm so pleased to see so many friends and colleagues here and students as well. And I'd really like to thank the conference organizing committee for inviting me to give this keynote, and in particular, Hannah, who has been a great colleague over the years and very supportive. It is an honor for me to be here today, and I am very happy to see everyone, even though we're not in person. We are making the best of it, and I think that that is the theme of 2020. We're doing our best. That's what we're doing. Okay. So Tournai Cathedral is well known as home to the first polyphonic Mass Ordinary compilation known to exist, the Tournai Mass. This Mass exemplifies the bourgeoning practice of scribal compilation. It consists of 6 stylistically disparate movements, which were composed separately and in some cases preserved in earlier manuscripts from other institutions. It has been upheld as a symbol of a new era of music composition in the Middle Ages, the advent of the polyphonic Mass Ordinary, serving as the inspiration for Guillaume de Machaut's Messe de Notre Dame. Over the past 150 years since its discovery, it has been reinterpreted and in some cases misinterpreted in musicological literature. Today, I offer a new perspective on this Mass based on evidence that I uncovered in the course of researching my book on confraternity liturgies in Paris and Tournai from the 14th through the 16th centuries. In my book, I established that the manuscript containing this Mass, which is manuscript 27 in the Tournai Cathedral archives, was owned and used by the confraternity of the Episcopal notaries at Tournai Cathedral. The Tournai Mass, therefore, was an integral part of the devotions of a community consisting of both clerics and laymen. My study of confraternities in general, and the votive masses and offices that were central to their devotions as they worshiped in the chapels of cathedrals, parishes, and monastic communities, shows that these organizations were driving forces in late medieval popular piety. Confraternities developed unique musical practices that occasionally went on to take a central place in the institutions where they met. In the case of the confraternity of the notaries at Tournai Cathedral, it is not just the polyphonic Mass that shows their commitment to new and innovative compositional practices, but also the monophonic works in their manuscripts that were written in mensural Ars Nova notation. In other words, for my students who are attending today, the chants form part of the Cantus Fractus repertory that is the theme of this conference. Michael Cuthbert, Jason Stossel, and Dennis Collins have recently shown that 2 of these compositions, a monophonic Kyrie and Sanctus in Ars Nova notation on the same fascicles as the Tournai Mass, were actually performed as polyphonic canons. The authors note that this was part of an improvised tradition that features compositional characteristics primarily associated with secular song. I argue that the composition of these works were influenced by the confraternity's connections to individuals and communities that promoted the composition of new music and poetry in urban centers in northern France. In this presentation, I will investigate the communities of musicians and composers known to have notaries among their ranks in Paris and Tournai, and how the repertory of the manuscripts owned by the Confraternity of the Notaries shows connections to them. Because we have almost no other documents concerning this confraternity and its members, its interaction with the cathedral, or anything regarding endowments for services or payment of musicians, it is the musical contents of their liturgical books that guide us in our quest for the contact this organization had with other cities and institutions. My talk proceeds in several parts. Part 1 gives an overview of confraternity devotions and their role in the cultivation of new music and devotional practices. Part 2 gives an overview of the liturgical books owned by the Confraternity of the Notaries and shows how these sources provide intriguing connections to local institutions and those further south in Paris. Part 3 explores who the notaries were, their connections to other geographical areas, and their education and possible musical training. This provides further insight into the contents of their liturgical books. Part 4 investigates the connection of notaries and chaplains at the cathedral to poetic societies that fostered the creation of secular poetry and motets. The Tournai Mass takes on a whole new use and meaning when it is viewed as an integral part of confraternity devotions because it can shed light on the musical activities of this and other similar organizations. Ultimately, the contents of the manuscripts owned by the Confraternity of the Notaries are vestiges of Tournai's rich, sacred, and secular musical heritage. Confraternities were important organizations that cultivated the composition of new plain chant and polyphony in the late medieval and early modern periods. My study of the chant books used by these organizations in Paris and Tournai uncovers a number of unique music compositions reflecting their devotional ethos. These range from votive masses and offices focused on relic translation to sequences in the vernacular, which indicate active participation on the part of the laity. The manuscripts used by these communities also contain a number of new Mass ordinary compositions in both Cantus Fractus and polyphony. Such works were often created using music and text that circulated primarily in confraternity settings, rather than drawing from the diocesan usage of the local cathedral or parishes. As a result, many confraternity liturgies vary widely from the diocesan usages practiced in the main sanctuaries of these institutions. The breadth and persistence of these divergences from diocesan practice shows that confraternity musical practices were not regulated or dictated by diocesan authorities. Most of the confraternities for which we have surviving liturgical books in Paris and Tournai are trade confraternities. These were essentially guilds responsible for regulating all aspects of their given trade, in addition to serving a spiritual role. Its members would meet regularly to celebrate votive masses and offices in honor of their patron saints, and sometimes participate in other important feasts throughout the year. Confraternities paid rent to local cathedrals, parishes, and monastic communities for the right to meet in one of the side chapels of these institutions. Confraternities also paid musicians from these churches to compile their services and to perform the votive masses and offices that were part of their devotions. These communities comprised both men and women of different socioeconomic standing who were active participants in the commercial life of late medieval France. As individuals, confraternity members were merchants, artisans, clerics, and students. As communities, they had the power to develop their own corporate identities, and this was done in part through cultivating new devotional practices involving music in honor of their patron saints. The Confraternity of the Notaries at Tournai Cathedral was particularly devoted to the Virgin Mary, St. Nicholas, and St. Catherine. The contents of their liturgical books show a number of unique musical practices in honor of these patron saints. In the course of my book project, I carried out a codicological study of liturgical books used by confraternities in the chapels of Tournai Cathedral alongside those used for services in the main sanctuary. Most of these sources are currently held in the Tournai Cathedral Archives, a private institution that grants limited access. Among the books in this collection is Manuscript 27, which contains the Tournai Mass. Edmond de Coussemaker and Charles Joseph Voisin discovered this source in 1862. They call the polyphonic setting the Messe des Notaires in passing, but did not say anything about the confraternity itself or how they established that the source was connected to this organization. By 1920, this nomenclature falls into obscurity, and the Mass is simply called the Tournai Mass. Coussemaker and subsequent authors have been mostly concerned with the polyphonic setting, primarily because it fed 19th century scholars' captivation with composers and works that served as models for what they perceived to be significant developments in Western art music. The Tournai Mass has also been upheld as a musical setting composed for an important event at the cathedral. This is related to Jacques Pique's discovery of a 1349 foundation by Jean de Pré, Bishop of Tournai, for a Mass cum nota to be sung in honor of the Virgin Mary in the main sanctuary of the cathedral. While this has been repeatedly cited as the context for the Tournai Mass, it does not logically follow that this polyphonic Mass is the one tied to that occasion. While most scholars have been solely interested in the Tournai Mass to the exclusion of the rest of the contents of manuscript 27, it is also important to point out that only a few musicologists have had access to the contents of the entire manuscript. The only other person, aside from myself, in the past 75 years, to my knowledge, who was able to view it was Michel Huglot, who published a codicological study and description of the manuscript's contents in 1988. Huglot concluded that based on the gathering structure and page rulings, the polyphonic Mass setting was an integral part of the manuscript rather than a later addition. I have discovered that the scribal hands and repertory transmitted in this source bear striking similarities to two other manuscripts in the cathedral archives that were owned and used by the Confraternity of the Notaries, who served the Bishop of Tournai, manuscripts 12 and 13. I go into great detail about this in chapter 1 of my book, but I'll briefly summarize those findings by saying all three manuscripts contain the same votive masses and offices for the Virgin Mary, identical repertories of sequences, and mass chants for St. Catherine and St. Nicholas that circulated only within this confraternity. This liturgical repertory does not appear in any of the books used in the main sanctuary of the cathedral. Manuscripts 12 and 13 also give some references to the confraternity's membership, as manuscript 12 contains a fabric describing the confraternity's material holdings, and manuscript 13 has a list of several members included as a later addition on one of the inside folios. Overall, the similarity between manuscripts 12, 13, and 27 demonstrates that manuscript 27 is actually a confraternity manuscript, and the Tournai Mass was part of their devotions. There are several works in these sources that show the confraternity's promotion of a Cantus Fractus repertory and their connections to institutions in other geographical areas. I'll start with the 5 Cantus Fractus settings. I've included references to authors who have discussed some of these works on the PowerPoint slide here. 4 of the settings appear in manuscript 27, with an additional one in manuscript 12. The Credo 1 and sequence, Mitit ad Virginem, circulated widely in Cantus Fractus in France, the Low Countries, and Italy. While most of the mensurally notated settings of Credo 1 are found in manuscripts and printed books from the late 15th century on, it was occasionally included in 14th century sources, such as those discussed here as well. Marco Gozzi's research on the rhythmic Credo 1 in Italy has revealed that Cantus Fractus settings like this were directly tied to local improvised polyphonic traditions in the 14th century, and this is likely the case at Tournai. On the other hand, there are specific references to improvised polyphony at Tournai Cathedral pertaining to Mitit ad Virginem in extra-liturgical contexts. For instance, starting in 1231, the Annunciation drama was performed in the main sanctuary on Ember Wednesday during Advent. At the end of the ceremony, the prosa Mitit ad Virginem was sung with organ and discant. While the Credo 1 and Mitit ad Virginem circulated widely, the 2 Kyries in the Sanctus and Cantus Fractus are unique to Tournai and likely local compositions. As we will see, all of them are composed using other chant melodies as models. The model for the Kyrie in Cantus Fractus on the Tournai folios was identified in the 1990s as being Kyrie 58 in the Landwehr Melnicki catalog. This melody was known in other manuscripts, but none of them come from Tournai or its surrounding areas in the 14th century. My study of all the confraternity books in the Cathedral archive shows that this Kyrie does appear in a source produced in the middle of the 15th century for the Confraternity of the Transfiguration, which also met at the Cathedral. It is possible that the Kyrie was known in other contexts in Tournai in the 14th century, and the source for it is now lost. The melodic model for the Sanctus in Cantus Fractus is another Kyrie melody, also found in the Landwehr Melnicki catalog as number 169. The first 5-note articulation of the word Sanctus matches the first 5 notes of the Kyrie melody exactly, and from that point on it is completely different. Using a different genre of Mass Ordinary chant as a model for another is known in other contexts and confraternity sources in Paris and in Tournai. For instance, the Agnus Dei Vinu, which appears in the manuscript for the Confraternity of the Transfiguration, is based on a Sanctus chant. As I mentioned earlier, this manuscript also contains the chant melody that was used as the basis for the Kyrie in Cantus Fractus. Through that manuscript for the Confraternity of the Transfiguration, we see how the chant repertory and compositional procedures present in the notary manuscripts a century earlier may have had some longevity at the cathedral. This third example that I'll put forth here is a Kyrie in Cantus Fractus from the late 14th or early 15th century in manuscript 12. In the example, you can see that it is very similar in its opening to the Kyrie in Liber Usualis Cycle 10, but it is transposed. The composer of this work employs a similar method of melodic modeling that I have identified in other new chant compositions in Paris and Tournai in my book. They adhere to a pre-existing melody for the opening notes, and this goes beyond establishing a chant formula, and from that point on, they diverge. These 3 examples, the 2 Kyries and Sanctus and Cantus Fractus, demonstrate that the Confraternity of the Notaries cultivated new polyphonic compositions, both written and improvised. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, Cuthbert, Stossel, and Collins have recently discovered that the Kyrie and Sanctus in the Tournai Mass folios, which were the first 2 examples that I discussed, were meant to be performed as polyphonic canons. They go into great detail concerning how these canons show compositional features that are also present in French secular songs, such as the chasse. This is a significant find, for it shows crossover between sacred and secular composition. To what extent the notaries themselves were involved in these creative efforts is a subject I will return to later. If we look at some of the other contents of the confraternity's liturgical books, we see vestiges of connections this confraternity may have had with artistic circles in other locations, particularly Paris. For instance, there is a Kyrie that appears in manuscript 27 on folio 34 recto on the gathering immediately following the one containing the Tournai Mass. It is introduced with the rubric Item de Nostra Domina, indicating that it is a chant for the Virgin Mary. This Kyrie melody is included in the Landwehr Melnicki catalog as number 114, and my study of the notary confraternity manuscripts reveals that it appears in them a total of 3 times. Once in manuscript 12 and twice in manuscript 27, including the occurrence just after the Tournai Mass mentioned here. The Melnicki 114 Kyrie melody became very widespread in later centuries, and it is even included in the Liber Usualis. Its absence in other 13th and 14th century sources from areas surrounding Tournai makes its appearance 3 times in the confraternity manuscripts particularly striking. This Kyrie was known earlier in Paris, as it is found in a 13th century gradual and sequentiary created around 1242 for use at the Sainte-Chapelle. The Melnicki 114 Kyrie is therefore related both to the devotions of the Confraternity of the Notaries and to institutions in Paris, which could imply that it and some of the other contents of the Confraternity's manuscripts have origins in the Paris region. Another example would be the Ite Missa Est motet at the end of the Tournai Mass. As Anne Robertson has shown, this 3-voice polyphonic work is based on the Ite Joseph chant melody, which was known in Paris. This chant was copied into 2 Notre Dame manuscripts, one from the 13th century and one from the 14th century, but it appears nowhere in sources from Tournai. The motet based on this chant also appears in a number of other manuscripts from outside Tournai, which I have listed here. One of them, the Ivrea Codex, transmits repertory associated with the French court. Karl Kuge points out that this motet bears marked musical and textual similarities to another work, Sequer Rex Beatus, from the interpolated Roman de Fauvel. Sequer Rex Beatus was composed around 1314 or 1315 by an unnamed musician known as the Master of the Royal Motets, who was a predecessor of Philippe de Vitry at the French court in the early 14th century. That the motet is based on a chant melody known in Paris suggests it was also written by someone who was familiar with Parisian liturgy. The Kyrie melody, Melniki 114, and the Ite Missa Est motet of the Tournai Mass both indicate that there was an avenue for a French court repertory to appear in the manuscripts used by the Confraternity of the Notaries. If we also take into account the discovery of Cuthbert, Stossel, and Collins, that part of the Cantus Fractus repertory in the manuscripts shows features of secular song, we begin to see the possibility that the notaries were connected to an international network of composers. While the contents of their liturgical books hint at these connections, these possibilities become even stronger when we examine the confraternity's membership, their travels, and their contact with important political figures in the 14th century. Conducting research on the Confraternity of the Notaries, its internal functioning, and its external interactions with the cathedral and diocese presents particular challenges, not least of all because most documentation has been lost. The state archives of Tournai were destroyed during World War II, leaving only these 3 manuscripts and scattered references to the notaries and other documents in the cathedral archives. Limited as they may be, these sources do provide at least some information about the confraternity and its membership, and most importantly, their connections to the bishop and other geographical areas. All that can be established about the confraternity's membership is that it was made up of clerics and married laymen who functioned as notaries in service to the Bishop of Tournai. Evidence of who they were as individuals can be established through references in a few documents from the 14th through the 16th centuries. For instance, a cathedral chapter act from 1347 and 1348 refers to several notaries by name, and in one case, a notary and his wife, Odard d'Assegny and his wife, Maria, dubbed the Otter. Manuscript 13 yields later clues about the members of the community in the 16th century, as it includes a handwritten addendum of 8 names, likely those of the confraternity provosts, copied on the recto of the opening flyleaf in a 16th century hand with the caption Notarii Anno 47. This distinction is probably a reference to the year 1547, since 2 of the names on the list are also found in other cathedral documents dating from 1526 to 1570. One of these men, Johannes Corvillan, held an administrative post directly delegated by the Bishop of Tournai, which gives an idea of the rank and prestige enjoyed by certain members of the organization. While individuals associated with the Confraternity of the Notaries are not often mentioned in earlier layers of the manuscripts, there are 2 proper names appearing in the fabric and manuscript 12, one of which could give some indication of the status of the organization within the cathedral community. The confraternity owned a gold covering cloth that was donated by a certain Master Walter Liebart, whose name does not appear in other documents from the cathedral at that time, but who was likely a member of the confraternity. More significantly, the fabric lists among the confraternity's holdings a piece of white wool cloth ornamented with armed beasts that was given to the organization by Jean de Pré, Bishop of Tournai. This is a later addition to the fabric, which would have been added sometime either during his reign as bishop from 1342 to 1349 or after. As mentioned previously in relationship to manuscript 13, in the 16th century, some of the confraternity members held high administrative positions at the cathedral that required close contact with the bishop, and this gift constitutes evidence of that relationship as early as the 14th century. These are the only references we have regarding the confraternity's membership. As a point of comparison, we can establish a bit more in general about the role of an episcopal notary as they functioned in other geographical locations. Episcopal notaries moved frequently Episcopal notaries moved frequently with the bishop as they were part of an important part of his close entourage. The bishops of Tournai were very politically active in both French and Burgundian territories because of Tournai's position at the crossroads of both empires. The city of Tournai itself fell under the jurisdiction of two dioceses, Cambrai and Tournai, with the Scheldt River serving as a natural dividing line in the center of the city. Furthermore, these two dioceses fell under the control of two different political territories, France and Burgundy. This means that while Tournai was part of France, there was a strong Burgundian presence there. The bishops held prominent positions on the Burgundian Ducal Council, since two of the most important cities in the diocese, Ghent and Bruges, were under the rule of the Burgundian dukes. They also traveled frequently to Paris, since the city of Tournai was under the dominion of the French crown. The bishop's notaries would have traveled everywhere with him, ensuring their presence at major political functions where music was performed. The notaries were thus optimally placed in a position to come into contact with music and text used outside of the Diocese of Tournai. If we circle back to what we can establish through the musical examples I discussed previously, we have a Kyrie melody and a motet in the Tournai Notary Confraternity manuscripts that demonstrate possible connections to an artistic circle in Paris. This becomes even more plausible when we consider that there were several famous examples of notaries who also were composers. Philippe de Vitry and Guillaume de Machaut are the most well-known. These two individuals are among a long list of composers who were notaries in service to various French royal houses, as well as the papal chapel in Rome. As Barbara Hay-Hulot has established, evidence of the musical output of notaries more broadly exists in the form of music notation in some of the documents they drafted. Furthermore, it was notaries who were responsible for the creation of the famous interpolated Roman de Fauvel manuscript, Bibliothèque Nationale Manuscript FR 146. Considering these broader European trends of the known musical activities of notaries, the confraternity of the notaries in Tournai could have similarly included several men who were capable of composing chant and polyphony for their own services. Returning to the membership of the confraternity, it is likely that at least some of those who were clergy could have risen through the ranks into that position after starting as young choir boys in the cathedral school or maîtrise, giving them the musical skills needed to compose plainchant or polyphony. Most of the existing detailed information about such organizations comes from the dioceses of Cambrai and Paris, but considering the patterns evident in surrounding institutions, it is likely that they functioned similarly in Tournai. Many of the boys who entered the maîtrise went on to study at the University of Paris or other prominent northern institutions when they came of age, and they would eventually go on to obtain high positions at ecclesiastical institutions. At Notre Dame in Paris, choir boys learned plain song, counterpoint, and descant, and we can assume that similar studies were pursued by choir boys at Tournai Cathedral. There were, therefore, certainly some members of the confraternity who were familiar enough with the liturgy to be able to take part in the musical practices of the organization. To sum up thus far, notaries were an educated group of laymen and clerics who traveled widely with the bishop, and their existing liturgical books show evidence of contact with institutions and artistic circles in Paris. But how does this relate to music composition and performance at institutions in Tournai? There are fleeting references to Tournai in recent scholarship that, when woven together, paint a vibrant picture of urban musical activity. If we start with the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Tournai, it was the seat of an important bishopric, and it was an institution with a strong musical heritage. Although much information has been lost, we can bring together some details about the possible role of music in the daily celebration of services there around the time the Tournai Mass and the works in Cantus Fractus were written. Anne Dupont estimates that the total number of those in service to the choir which includes choir boys, canons, and chaplains, not just those who took part in singing, but the complete clergy more broadly, was around 130 men and boys in the 15th century, and Craig Wright gives a similar estimate for the choir of Notre Dame in Paris. This gives you some perspective on the magnitude of the cathedral's musical establishment. Performing votive masses, like those found in the manuscripts used by the Confraternity of the Notaries, was a regular duty for the clergy of the institution. Beyond the cathedral, the city of Tournai enjoyed a rich and very public musical culture in the 14th and 15th centuries. Gretchen Peters points out that instrumentalists from Tournai were among the most prominent musicians in France during the 14th and 15th centuries, and references to their employment appear in documents from northern centers like Lille and surrounding towns, Paris, and as far south as Toulouse and Montpellier. These musicians were in the employ of both cities and confraternities, and they were known to play during annual processions as well as for private masses. Moreover, the city of Tournai is the setting for a vernacular religious play that was well known throughout northern France, The Boy and the Blind Man. Some of the most important organizations in northern France and the Low Countries that focused on the composition of new music and poetry were called chambers of rhetoric, or puy. Puy flourished in cities like Arras, Tournai, and other urban centers in the north. They are also considered confraternities. Carol Symes has done a significant amount of research in the famous puy in Arras, the confraternity of the Jongleurs, exploring their role in the creation of poetry and drama. Most recently, Brianne Dolce has established that the puy included both men and women who were merchants, private citizens, members of the working class, members of the clergy, monks, beguines, and nuns among its membership. This organization and others like it represent a very broad group of individuals who come together for artistic pursuits. One could be a member both of a trade confraternity and one of the puy. A particular interest to me here is that such organizations often had notaries and cathedral chaplains among their ranks as evidence of the intersection of membership between them. There was, in fact, a puy in Tournai in the 14th century that was modeled on the one in Arras. The unique compositions found in the notary's liturgical books may be viewed as part of Tournai's artistic legacy that provided its professionals with multiple modalities with which to pursue and invest in music. The connections between the cathedral and other civic and ecclesiastical institutions in Tournai is most firmly established through existing writings from a local monastery and through music texts. In his Meditations of 1350, Gilles de Muissis, abbot of the monastery of Saint Martin in Tournai, mentions poet-composers working in the vicinity in the mid-14th century, right around the time that the chants and Cantus Fractus I discussed previously were composed. De Muissis lists Philippe de Vitry, Jean de la Motte, Jean Campion, Guillaume de Machaut, and Collard Robier, lauding their artistic output. Campion and Le Muissis were both based in Tournai, and the other names mentioned here in the chronicles suggest that composers at important courts and ecclesiastical institutions from different cities were also known there. Some of the same composers are mentioned in the motet Apollinis Eclipsator Zodiacum Signis Lustrantibus that appears in the Ivrea Codex, which was one of the same sources for the Tournai Ite Missa Est motet I discussed previously. This work lists a roster of northern musicians, referring to them as part of a musicorum collegio. The life and career of Jean Campion, one of the composers praised by Le Muissis in his Meditations, is an example of the intersection of all the themes I've discussed here: clergy at Tournai Cathedral, artistic circles in the city, and contact with musicians in other cities. Yolanda Plumley shows that while Campion was a chaplain at Tournai Cathedral in 1350, he had contact with individuals associated with the University of Paris. The Muissis and Campion were both part of a group centered around creating music and poetry, which Plumley calls an informal puy. This is based on an inscription in BN manuscript Latin 3343, which contains a trouvère poem that was sent to Campion via post from Paris by a notary named Jean de Savoie. Both Campion and Savoie were associates of Philippe de Vitry, which places them again within the network of musicians discussed here. Campion's associates did not only include clergy, monks at neighboring monastic communities, and notaries in Paris, but also laymen in the city of Tournai. An example is the will of Peter de Mel, who was a citizen of Tournai. He left several items to Campion in a bequest transcribed by Plumley, which I include here. To Sir Jean Campion, I give my Book of the Rose, referring to the Roman de la Rose, and all my scrolls containing motets and songs that he will find and recognize. What is of particular interest to me in this bequest is the reference to motets. As I discussed earlier, manuscript 27 contains the Ite Missa Es motet that was likely composed by a predecessor of Vitry at the French court. This could be one of the examples of the types of motets that Campion was familiar with through his contact with other musicians in the community. I do not mean to imply that Campion was the composer of the chants in Cantus Fractus in manuscript 27. My point here is to show how the repertoire and the liturgical books used by the confraternity of the notaries mirrors musical activity in the city of Tournai itself, and how individuals working at the cathedral were an active part of this. The distinctive plainchant and polyphony and manuscripts used by the confraternity of the notaries are all products of a tradition of modeling, either based on pre-existing text or music. I discuss this at length in my book, and I've given you only a few examples here from the Cantus Fractus repertory and the Ite Missa Es motet. Confraternities in urban Puy were important places for the creation of works in such a fashion. The approach to poetic composition closely parallels music composition in the 14th century, especially in the use of pre-existing material. One organization that provides fruitful evidence of this is the Goldsmiths Confraternity in Paris. This community promoted the creation of new poetry based on earlier models that had circulated within the confraternity for decades. It is possible that in the confraternity of the notaries, sacred music was composed in a similar fashion based on modeling. As Emily Snow-Thalen has pointed out, chambers of rhetoric were responsible a century later for the construction of an office for the Seven Sorrows of the Virgin Mary in Brussels. Some of the movements of the Tournai Mass could have similarly been written under the influence of urban Puy and chambers of rhetoric 100 years earlier. So where are the melodic models for the polyphonic settings and chants in Cantus Fractus in the manuscripts used by the confraternity of the notaries? The chants that were used as the basis for them do not survive in manuscripts from Tournai that date from the time that the Tournai Mass was composed. The canonic Kyrie and Sanctus and Cantus Fractus are examples of melodic modeling, as they are both based on pre-existing chant melodies, and they use compositional techniques from secular song. However, the melodic models for the Kyrie, Gloria, Credos, Sanctus, and Agnus Dei of the Tournai Mass have not been identified. If we return to where we started, the three manuscripts owned and used by the confraternity of the notaries, we can see that their contents and the new recognition of their role as confraternity manuscripts opens us up to a host of new avenues for future research. Investigating 14th century urban Puy and their possible role in the composition of sacred music allows us to see how the lines between sacred and secular composition are in many ways blurred. Brianne Dolce, Jason Stossel, and Dennis Collins have all noted how compositional practices cross repertories and traditions. Looking at these compositions as part of the devotions of a community of men who traveled widely and had contact with artistic circles that specialized in both sacred and secular works opens our eyes to new possibilities. The composers of the works in the Tournai confraternity manuscripts may never be accurately identified, but we can be sure that they were part of the clerical culture of poet composers who functioned as instrumentalists, church choir singers, chaplains, and notaries. They were colleagues and friends who moved in different overlapping circles. These men had many ties to neighboring cities, cathedrals, and courts, and they also had a presence in Paris. Ultimately, seeing the contents of these manuscripts as vestiges of confraternity practice changes our focus from looking within the cathedral walls for inspiration to looking outward to the notaries' connections to the larger Tournaisian community and their travels to other cities. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, very, very much for this beautiful paper, rich on material observations, taking us to Tournai and its musical landscape, to all these institutions and milieux, and also reminding us when we think or work on one repertory, it's one of many. So this plurality of repertories and styles that could influence each other on a very particular way. I'm sure that we will have a couple of questions. And then I wanted to say, you either can raise your hand. I don't know if you are familiar with this function. If you go to the function participants on the bottom of the screen, you can see the function raise hand. And I see that you raise hand and want to ask question. Otherwise you can also write briefly in chat, I have a question, and you can start talking. I'm sure that there will be a lot of questions.
You know, what I've realized in teaching this semester is actually, you know, letting students take the time to write in the chat is really a good thing. So at least long, awkward pauses on our end, but on the other end, it's actually kind of a welcome thing, I think.
Luisa has a question, and then Brian Dolce, I don't know. So Luisa is first.
So since mine is just a comment, maybe Brian should be first, because I mean mine was just a praise, a comment of praise. So I will leave my time to Brian.
Don't worry, Luisa, just say your comment and then we can go on.
I mean, I just wanted to thank you for this excellent keynote, and which actually made me think a lot of things about how to reframe really the teaching of this repertory in the classroom. So I'm really looking forward to reading your book. That was my comment, and thank you so much, really.
Thank you.
Sharing with many of us. Okay, so then Brian Dolce.
Hi, Sarah, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. What an exciting paper. And I also cannot wait to read your book. There's just so much rich information. I have kind of a clarifying question, but it's more of a, like, if we had more stuff, what would you expect to find question as well? And it's kind of about the membership, because you talk about confraternity membership as not just having to sort of be the people that the job, for lack of a better word, represents. So do you have a feeling from what you have sort of looked at that if we had better records of the confraternity membership, that we would be looking at a sort of larger and more diverse population than just notaries even? And if so, how do you think that would sort of change things if sort of a wonderful document from the mid-14th century came up with 3 years of confraternity members? Do you have a sense of who you might find in addition to the notaries?
Yeah, so the notary confraternity it's specifically a trade confraternity. So you would have to be a notary to be a member of it. So it really was just for the notaries. But there are several different types of confraternities, right? So for one, the word confraternity, I notice when I say that word to people who aren't medievalists, they're like, what? I don't know what that is, which, you know, automatically puts me at a different disadvantage because I have to describe what it means. You know, there's guilds, right? So if you think about the trade confraternities that I study in Paris, those are essentially trade guilds. Some of them are not, like the book production community. Actually, their trade is regulated by the university. It's not regulated by the statutes of the confraternity, right? But they are essentially guilds. But then you've also got purely devotional confraternities that spring up at different parish churches. And I've got several examples in Paris, at least, of printers who belong to their trade confraternity. They also belong to a devotional confraternity. So you can belong to more than one confraternity. There's no limit. What I would expect to find is a longer list of who these notaries were. I would probably also, if we have more documents, expect to find names of some of the same names as in earlier documents as cathedral choir boys and things of that sort. I would expect to find more about their relationship to the bishop and other organizations within the cathedral. What I would probably also expect to find is references if we had more documents from some of the devotional confraternities and other organizations some of the same names in those as well, just as you have found with the Puy and Arras, many names of people. You found names of nuns, you found names of Beguines, you found names of people from all walks of life, surprising breadth there. And I would suspect that in Tournai, things worked similarly, although I don't know exactly for sure because we have lost so much.
Catherine Bradley had a comment, or just no? So
just,
maybe
it's just for the chat. It's not really relevant.
Yeah,
Thank you for wonderful. Thank you.
okay.
No, yeah. What is it that you say in the chat here? I just kind of want to see what you say.
Oh, sorry, I'm having some problems with my camera, but basically I just have an example of a motet from around the 1270s in a Parisian source where the triplet tells us, I made this to accord with the two voices and I brought it from my home country around Tournai. So it's just another proof of this cross-fertilization between Tournai and Paris. Yeah.
We'll have to talk about this and maybe we can talk further about this later.
Absolutely, yes, please. Thank you for a wonderful paper.
Thank you.
Lenka Hlavková raised her hand.
Hello, thank you very much for your inspiring lecture. And I'm already looking forward to the final discussion because I'm very happy to hear about connections between Cantus Fractus, polyphony and secular music, because I think this is probably one of important principles for composition of Cantus Fractus in Central Europe. And I will talk about it a little bit tomorrow, and probably there'll be something more on Wednesday. So probably we can, at the end, we can come to a conclusion or just to start something new. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I really honestly feel like this is the beginning, right? Like we're at the very beginning of seeing how lots of these connections can play out, right? Because the discovery that this is a confraternity manuscript, and let me also just say a little bit about that because I didn't get a chance to cram it into the paper. I had so much that I wanted to put in there. It didn't get in there. So Coussemaker calls it the Messe des Notaires, and it's referred to like that through the end of the 19th century. Then in 1920, it's not called that anymore because Friedrich Ludwig had some correspondence with the archivist at the Cathedral archives who indicated that Canon Voisin actually confused the manuscript 12, which we know, which has an inscription about the notaries, with manuscript 27. So that was no longer, so he indicated that he confused these two things. What we find with Tournai is because it's a private archive, the Cathedral archive, and it has such limited access, oftentimes the only, the information that you get is filtered through the archivist. And that has been something that started, I think, in the 19th century. So a lot of references in musicological scholarship from the late 19th and early 20th centuries came through those archivists who may or may not have been right. And I was allowed access to these books for the first time altogether, which was an amazing thing. And I'm very grateful for it. Now, I mean, it's an archive that's open once a week, but also they have limited seats. So there are weeks and weeks and weeks where you're not able to go. So it's really just a limited thing. So.
Pavel Gacacik raised his hand.
Yes, thank you very much for this very inspiring lecture. I have a question concerning confraternities manuscripts. Are there maybe special features of these manuscripts? I mean, something like a special decoration of many scribes in comparison to chant manuscripts, this regular chant manuscripts or other kind of manuscripts?
Well, they don't necessarily look different, but they certainly have what I would call, in some cases, a motley array of chants that seem to come from a variety of different geographical locations. Now, for trade confraternities, you can reconcile that a little bit because people would travel to different cities to learn trades sometimes. So there was sort of a trade confraternity network among certain trades. So sometimes you see the same chants in one trade confraternity manuscript in one geographical area pop up in the same, in a manuscript for another confraternity in another place because of that. And I think Barbara may have asked actually about if there were other confraternities at the cathedral. I think I saw a question about that. And the answer to that is yes, the Confraternity of the Transfiguration. And I briefly mentioned the manuscripts that they used throughout. I think I mentioned it twice in this presentation as a point of comparison, but you also see similar repertories pop up in different confraternities within the same institution, because you've got the same musicians that are performing for those masses and offices, right? Because that's their duty within the cathedral. Now, the interesting thing is, if you compare oftentimes these manuscripts with those that are used in the main sanctuary of the cathedral, they're very, very different. So they're not using the same repertory, which really shows that confraternities are not heavily regulated by diocesan authorities. I mean, in some cases, I'm sure there are exceptions, but in Paris, that was an interesting thing to find out because the Parisian church was pretty conservative in that respect, but they seemed to really just let confraternities do whatever they wanted. And it may have also been a situation where the musicians that were paid to write music for these confraternities saw that as a way that was of a creative outlet for themselves, like, oh, I can do something really interesting here in consultation with the confraternity.
Are there any other questions? I have just a comment because you mentioned Metit ad Virginem and we heard about the sequence before. This is actually one of these few examples where we have the rhythmicized interpretation indicated in Bohemian manuscripts around 1400 as well. One of very, very few. So there was something about this sequence that it was so much spread, underwent so many elaborations. We have also already in 1380 Metit ad Virginem combined with a strophic song. So it goes always one stanza of Metit ad Virginem, another stanza of strophic song. Also Hungarian.
Is it in the vernacular? A strophic song in the vernacular?
No, it's in Latin, unfortunately. It would be too nice to have it.
Yeah, I was like, well, wait.
But you can imagine that they would do it in vernacular as well. It was only not written. And I know that from my Hungarian colleagues that they have also special version, a particular version of Metit ad Virginem. So I noted that there are some repertories that connect us all and that were, depending on where they were distributed, somehow were otherwise elaborated, which is quite, I think, interesting. I think, Barbara had a comment on that. Barbara, you are muted.
Okay, all right. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah, I was just wondering, I mean, this was something that sort of emerged from what I was looking at, whether it's because of the connection with Christ, because Metit ad Virginem is the Annunciation, that is the Incarnation. And what are the chants that I at least was finding with mensural notation or with Cantus Fractus, they're all somehow connected with Christ. And of course, to find a kind of hidden way to infuse Christ into the liturgy is obviously something very desirable and sensible in a way, because why are we having the Mass? It's because of Christ. So that would be my guess.
That's really,
and it's only a guess.
But that's also really interesting because in the case of Mititat Virginem, which it pops up a lot in my book too as the basis for sequences for Saint Nicholas. And I found one that's actually has a text in the vernacular for Saint Nicholas, but because if Mititat Virginem, the tune, has these associations with Christ and with the Annunciation, then that carries over even when it has contrafacta associated with it. So you get these multiple meanings all along the way.
And also Nicholas, don't forget, is in the Advent period.
Yeah, exactly. This is what I wanted also to say, that it connects the, well, it was in Bohemia, at least it was performed really in the Advent time. So is it the general use of the sequence? Is it just the Advent, or do you have?
Well, the Annunciation drama is always done during Advent because Annunciation falls during Lent, and you can't have liturgical drama during Lent. So you celebrate all those things during Advent.
Yeah, it's the Missus ceremony.
Great. Jeremy Fluerin raised the hand. Hi, Jeremy.
Hi, thanks very much, Sarah, for the paper. Really enjoyed it. This is not my career, I should say, and I may have missed something in your paper. I'd be interested if you could talk a little bit more about the notaries and the organisation of the notaries.
Say that again, Jeremy. It's hard to hear you.
I wonder if you could say more about notaries and the organisation, the material organisation of repertory across the three manuscripts which you presented today. The reason I'm interested is, of course, at the back of my mind, there's the idea of Machaut as notary, as it were, with his authorial prowess, organising repertory in order to reflect his own experience.
Yeah, so that's a good question. As far as the notary's manuscripts are concerned, one of them, manuscript 12, is basically, this is another thing that I found through my codicological study. It's basically several manuscripts that have been bound together because originally the confraternity had things that circulated just in individual fascicles, right? So you'd have one that had offices for the Virgin Mary. You'd have one that had masses for the Virgin Mary. You had one that had an office and mass for St. Nicholas, and one that had an office and mass for St. Catherine. So they were organizing things according to, they were lumping things together according to feast days. And then someone at some point bound that all together in manuscript 12. Manuscript 13 contains only masses for the Virgin Mary. Manuscript 27 is by far the one that is the most difficult to reconcile. It's mostly a curiale, so that's a large part of its contents. But it also has the same identical repertory of sequences. It's got masses for the Virgin Mary in it. And all of these have masses for the Virgin Mary. All three manuscripts do. But as far as how they were organized, like I said, like the manuscript 13 is actually quite small. It's only 20 folios. So, it really does only have a couple of masses that are associated together. Manuscript 12, like I said, is bound together, but manuscript 27, you turn one page and you have, oh, okay, so here's a mass for the dead. And then you turn another page and you're like, and now we're back to Kyries. And then you turn another, it really seems like it was, after a while, that manuscript may be one where they were just copying things as they came along. Did that answer your question, Jeremy?
We still have time. If you are still energy, Sarah, we still have time for other questions.
Really fun.
I see many faces of admiration, expression of admiration for this great work. I wanted to ask you, it has something to do with Jeremy's question. I saw in your first example that you have shown us, there was something like an addition with another notation, with square notation. So do you have something like various levels of the repertory in these books?
Yes, yes. The levels of repertory span from starting in the 13th century, then you've got additions from the 14th and the 15th century and up into the 16th century. So large part of it is 13th and 14th century repertoire. And then you have, especially in manuscript 12, you've got things added that were done in the 15th century. Those are usually handwritten addenda. But yeah, the large part of it is 13th and 14th century repertoire. But yeah, you've got a lot of different types of notation as well. And this was another thing that I found interesting. You might have something that's written in square notation, and then in the margins, years later, someone used Messine notation to clarify for themselves, right? So you've got people who have different specializations or familiarities with different types of notation, different comfort levels, I think, with different types of notation. And I found that very interesting. This is something that also you see in this geographical area, this crossover between Messine notation and square notation. So you never know what you're going to get. And when you actually look at the books from the Cathedral that have that type of Messine notation, it really is very different from what you see in further south in France, where you still see like the Metz notation, and further north when you start to get to Dutch notation and Hofnagelschrift. It's something that's a hybrid. It's somewhere between.
That's really very interesting. Luisa raised her hand.
I have a curiosity about the use of pneumatic notation as marginal addition. Have you noticed consistency in meaning in what context and for what purpose? Is it used for rhythmic purposes? It is used for, do you have a sense of why and when and it is used and with what function?
Yeah, so I mean, sometimes you see things in Messine notation just because that's the notation that the people were using in general. But when it's when it's actually appears in the margins next to the notation, is that what you're talking about? To me, it says phrasing. Perhaps they're looking at it as, oh, it's easier for me to visualize how this sounds if I write it in Messine notation because it has more of a fluid script, right? Rather than looking at it in square notation. I don't
more
know.
Expressive in a way. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah.
I wonder if in a different context and a different historical period, there might be some connection in the ways people understood neumes and used neumes and they added neumes to poems, to poetry. I wonder, because I mean, people have been wondering what is the meaning of using Sangal neumes in the Lament of Dido, in the was it because it was really sang, or it's because of expressive reasons somehow? And I wonder if there can be a similar meaning to your marginal additions. I don't know. I mean, I'm just wondering.
No, that's interesting. And I've not heard of this. So when does this happen? You said they...
It happens earlier, maybe 11th, 12th century at latest, but you know, I mean, there are some studies, I can send you some references, but I wonder if the meaning of using these neumes in context where it's not necessary may mean something that goes beyond the understanding of the melody, but more toward the understanding of, as you were saying, the expressivity of the passage, maybe.
Yeah, I haven't thought of it. That's a really interesting perspective that I'll have to, I mean, I'd like to learn more about that. So do send me what you have.
Sure.
That'd be really cool to look at.
Brian Dolce had I hope that I pronounced it correctly. Yes, has this question.
You're doing fine. That's okay. Yeah, so this conversation about notation, Sarah, is also really interesting. And it sort of, I think, links to a very large question that I'm kind of having as this discussion goes on and thinking about your presentation, which is that I'm really intrigued by the concept of overlapping notations in this region, because that's something that I see in Aros as well, like in a single chant sometimes in 13th century liturgical books, shifting kind of notational practices, which is quite interesting. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more, but you kind of pointed out a bit about Tournai's specific geographic location and how that links to its political location and its sort of religious location as well. And if there's anything specific about that in the way that sort of the musical bits of these confraternities play out, if you think that there's any, that it has to do with anything, because it's quite different from Paris, I think. And it seems kind of interesting to me, but it's a very broad question.
Well, it's very different from, well, Paris is interesting because you've got everybody from everywhere who comes to Paris, right? So that's where, you know, you've got this influx of everything, but Paris is very clearly under the control of the French crown. And it's, you know, it's France, it's the center of France. Tournai is this strange area that's divided, and you've got Tournai and Cambrai, which are, there's this close connection between the two, which Barbara, I'm sure, knows very well, and I think we've talked about before. They, you know, they're neighboring dioceses. The weird part about the geography of the city of Tournai is you've got the cathedral on one side of the river. The river divides the diocesan boundary. So you stand outside the cathedral and you look over at the Diocese of Cambrai. Okay, so half the city's institutions are under a different diocese, right? So Tournai, even though the city of Tournai is, you know, the heart of the bishopric, is under the jurisdiction of the French crown. You've also got most of that diocese being in Burgundian territory, right? So you've got these bishops that are really, they have a lot of contact with the Burgundians, right? So I think, you know, that you've got, that means that at the cathedral and the notaries that are traveling with these bishops, they're in contact with people at the Burgundian court. They're in contact with people at the French court. They're in contact with people at the cathedral in Cambrai. They're in contact with people in Liège. They're in contact with people all over. So they just have this, it's just a unique place to be. It's a very messy ecclesiastical and political situation. I say messy not in the bad sense, but in the sense that it is fruitful for this type of study. Question of language in Tournai: how Dutch, how French? Okay, yeah, the diocese is mostly Dutch speaking. You are right, Barbara. But Tournai is very French, and the documents that I find there are very much French. And this is another strange thing too, in doing work in Belgium. So I did some work in Liège for a while, and you still find in Liège sometimes you find confraternities where people spoke Dutch, and you have confraternity books that don't have any music in them, but still I looked at them, that are books in Dutch. And I was talking to an archivist there once, and he was like, oh yeah, he said, that still happens. You know, he was like, there's still Dutch speakers that live here. Yeah, northern France and, you know, the entire country of Belgium really is a crossroads linguistically and artistically. And in that way, I guess it all kind of belongs together.
Other questions concerning the music, institutions, language, books, inscriptions, Cantus Fractus? What I have also one comment, and it was when I looked at your example of Cantus Fractus on a Kyrie, and also remembering examples from Barco Guzzi in his anthology. This is quite sophisticated rhythm. This is different that our dum, da dum, da dum, da dum. So I wonder when we distinguish in polyphony, simple polyphony, and sophisticated polyphony, if there was something similar on this rhythmical level, that we have just simple rhythm and sophisticated rhythm, and it would indicate different level of artificiality. But this is something like an idea that comes as I see your examples that we might explore. They are for sure two different words of Cantus Fractus. Simple, trochaic, rather rhetorical, so reclamation rather than composition in rhythm. And your examples.
I think it's highly likely, actually, that the long example that I provided, the third one, the Kyrie that's in manuscript 12 that I had transcribed, that one, I feel when I first saw it, I was like, this looks like it has to be a voice of a of a completely composed polyphonic work. Like, I think sometimes that happens as well. One of the things that I talk about in my book is the Sanctus and Agnus Dei Vinu, which has been, Craig Wright has talked about it, David Follows has talked about it, but it pops up in a Tournai confraternity manuscript, and the Agnus Dei is very different from the Agnus Dei in other sources because it has to accommodate this lengthy trope text. So, you've got that added to this as well. So sometimes you've got alternate texts that are added or trope texts that are added that that mean that you have to add extra notes or something like that. But the Sanctus Vinu is a tenor for one of Dufay's works that appears basically the tenor appears monophonically in other sources, and it sort of spawned this improvised tradition based on that tenor. So sometimes you see that, like individual voices that circulate and people can improvise around them.
Okay, so the call for the last question. Meanwhile, we have evening here in Central Europe, and we are coming to the noon, I think, your lunchtime in your Midwest. So if not, I would like to thank all of you, the presentees, Sarah for her keynote, once again, for cheers for cheering these sessions, you all who stayed with us the whole afternoon. I saw some glimpses into presentations tomorrow afternoon. I'm chairing one session. I would say do not miss it. This is really something worth to see. So I'm very much hoping to see you all tomorrow. For today, have a nice evening and or the rest of the day, and I'm very much looking forward to see you tomorrow. Okay, bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.